Greetings and a warm welcome to the Manifested e-learning platform. Today we are going to continue with the subject auditing and assurance. The topic is audit documentation. This is a new topic which has 11 subtopics, namely 1. Reasons and importance of audit documentation. 2. Sources, features and purposes of working papers. 3. Storage of working papers. 4. Custody on working papers. 5. Standardization of working papers. 6. Safe custody and retention of working papers. 7. Form and content of working papers. 8. Automated working papers. 9. Quality control policies and procedures implemented by audit firms. 9. Quality control policies and procedures implemented by audit firm. That is number 9. 10. Objectives of quality controls to the audit firm. And lastly, peer review and objectives. These are 11 subtopics. You are going to study one subtopic at a time, beginning with the reasons and importance of audit documentation. Reasons and importance. These are two things. And candidates, audit documentation can be defined as working papers. Audit documentation refers to working papers, and audit documentation is a detailed record of audit procedures that are performed, the relevant audit evidence obtained, and conclusions reached by the auditor. You recall, candidates, that at the end of the audit process, the auditor is required to generate an audit opinion. The auditor is required to express an opinion on the financial statements. And before expressing an opinion, the auditor is required to gather sufficient appropriate evidence to support the audit opinion. And this audit evidence is to be based on what we are calling working papers or documentation. So audit documentation is also referred to as working papers, and it is the detailed record of audit procedures that are performed, the relevant audit evidence that is obtained, and the conclusions that the auditor reached. You understand? So that's the meaning of audit documentation. In this lesson, we are going to discuss 1. Reasons, 2. Importance. So let's begin with the reasons. Why is it important, or what are the reasons for maintaining working papers? What is the reason? Now, the first reason for audit documentation is related to evidence of compliance with auditing standards. Evidence of compliance. Audit documentation is evidence of compliance with auditing standards, because candidates, documentation demonstrates that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with international standards on auditing or other applicable auditing standards and the relevant legal and regulatory requirements. Because candidates, you recall we mentioned earlier that the auditor cannot just carry out the audit process the way he wants. No, the auditor is required to adhere to certain standards on auditing. There are procedures which the auditor has to comply with in the process of carrying out his or her work. So maintaining audit documentation is evidence of that compliance. By looking at the documentation, it is possible to tell whether the auditor complied with the auditing standards. And this is crucial for maintaining the credibility and the professionalism of the audit. So one reason for maintaining working papers is that these working papers work as evidence of compliance with auditing standards or any other applicable auditing standards. The second reason is related to the audit opinion. Audit documentation supports the audit opinion, the auditor's report. It supports the auditor's report and opinion which is contained in the auditor's report. Audit documentation provides sufficient and appropriate record of the basis for the auditor's report, including the opinion that is expressed on the financial statements. And all findings, all analyses, and all conclusions that lead to the audit opinion must be clearly documented. If the auditor arrives or expresses a positive opinion, there has to be evidence that leads to such a positive opinion. If the opinion is adverse, then there has to be sufficient documentation. There ought to be working papers that support such an adverse opinion. So, audit documentation or working papers support the auditor's report and opinion. Now, audit documentation is also important for the purposes of accountability and review. Accountability and review. Audit documentation enables the effective supervision and review of the audit work by supervisors, by managers, and even the external reviewers. For example, the peer reviews, the regulatory inspections, and so on. Because candidates sometimes the auditor may be required to be audited. Audit review is simply auditing of auditors. When auditors are to be reviewed, then that review, that auditing of auditors must be based on the audit documentation. It is not possible to review the auditor's work where working papers are not available. So auditors are required to maintain working papers so that their work can be reviewed, so that managers and supervisors can review such work. And it helps to ensure that individual audit team members are accountable for the work they perform. So such that if there is any error or if there is any mistake in the audit process, it's possible to point out who made the error, and that helps in improvement of the quality of the audit. That's the fourth reason of maintaining audit documentation. Number 4. Candidates, we are discussing reasons for maintaining working papers. The fourth reason is in relation to planning and performance of the audit. Planning and performance of the audit. What do I mean by planning and performance of the audit? By planning, I mean by this, that audit documentation assists the audit team in planning and performing the audits by providing historical record of the client's business, risk and internal controls, and so on. And that allows for more efficient and effective audits in subsequent periods. Where there are working papers, where working papers are maintained, these working papers can help in the planning and performance of subsequent audits. You can imagine, candidates, if you are to take over from an auditor who was not maintaining audit working papers, where there is no history of these audits, then it's not possible to even know where to begin. But if working papers are in place, the incoming auditor can rely on the work or the audit documentation of the outgoing auditor. And that's the importance. What is otherwise these audit working papers have to be maintained. 5. Facilitates communication. Audit documentation facilitates communication. Documentation serves as a shared reference point for the audit team, which then promotes consistent understanding of audit procedures and objectives. It also helps auditors communicate their findings and recommendations to the management and also to the audit committees and other stakeholders. So, audit documentation facilitates communication. 6. Risk management. There's another reason related to risk management and mitigation. By documenting the understanding of the client's business, by documenting identified risks, and also the auditor's responses to those risks, audit documentation aids in risk assessment and helps mitigate potential liabilities for the auditor in case of disputes or litigation. In case of disputes or litigation. The 7th reason is knowledge transfer and continuity. Knowledge transfer means transferring of knowledge. So, audit documentation provides a valuable record for future audits of the same entity, allowing new audit team members to quickly understand the client's operations, past audit approaches, and any recurring issues. And this promotes efficiency, and it also promotes continuity in the audit process. That's self-explanatory, is it not? Yes. 8. Quality control. How is quality control a reason for maintaining working papers? Now, audit documentation is subjected to rigorous quality control and review processes. And this ensures that audit procedures are consistently applied and the audit work is conducted in compliance with auditing standards and auditing guidelines. That is how quality control is one of the reasons for audit documentation. Now, these are 8 reasons for audit documentation. Let's move on to discuss the importance. What is the importance of audit documentation? Now, one reason why audit documentation is important is in relation to credibility and reliability. Credibility and reliability. Audit documentation enhances the credibility and the reliability of audit process and the auditor's opinion by providing tangible evidence of the work performed, The second reason why audit documentation is important is accountability. Accountability. But let me first discuss transparency. First of all, discuss transparency. Now, audit documentation candidates promotes transparency in the audit process, allowing the interested parties to understand how the audit was conducted and the basis for conclusions reached. Because by looking at how the audit was performed, the audit procedures that were carried out, because all that is contained in the audit working papers. One can go through the audit working papers, look at the procedures that were performed. One can analyze the evidence that was gathered by just looking at the audit working papers, then link all that work with the conclusion that is reached, and that promotes transparency, because the auditor's work can be is open. When the auditor documents his work, is putting in openly how the work was performed and how the conclusions were reached. So that promotes what we are calling transparency or openness in the audit process. That's why auditors are required by the standards to ensure that audit documentation, audit working papers are maintained. And that is deterrent in a way, because the auditor cannot just carry out the work without documenting. So when the auditors are compelled to document their work, that promotes transparency. Okay. Then it also allows the interested parties, like the shareholders, like the government or the management, to understand how the audit was conducted. It's not possible to understand how the audit was conducted if there is no evidence of work that was carried out, of the procedures that were performed. So that helps in understanding. The stakeholders can understand how the audit was performed and the basis for the conclusions that are reached in the auditor's report. Another importance is related to legal defense. Legal defense. Now, in the event of legal challenges or allegations of negligence and so on, well-maintained audit documentation serves as a critical defense, demonstrating that the auditor acted with due professional care and in accordance with the applicable standards. When the auditor is challenged, it could be in a court of law. The auditor may be sued for negligence. The audit working papers can serve as a legal defense for the auditor. The auditor can prove that he or she or the audit firm adhered to the profession standards and that the auditor carried out his work in accordance with applicable standards. And that can be a defense where there are challenges, where there are legal challenges, and so on. So that's why the auditor should maintain audit working papers. Number 4, audit working papers can also be used as training tool. Training tool can be used as training tool. Audit working papers acts as an excellent training tool for new or less experienced auditors, helping them understand audit procedures, best practices, and also the rationale behind the audit decisions. 5, efficiency. Now, while creating documentation takes time, it ultimately improves the audit efficiency by providing a clear roadmap for current and future audits, which then reduces the need to redo work or to regather information. So, audit documentation supports efficiency, leads to efficiency. Another importance of audit documentation or audit working papers is that these working papers can be used as reference for future audits. Working papers can be used as reference for future audits. Audit documentation, in other words, establishes a solid foundation for future audits, enabling auditors to build upon previous work and focus on new or evolving risks. That's why we are saying that audit documentation serves as reference for future audits. Where audit working papers are maintained, then such working papers can be used as reference. That is to mean that future audits can refer to the previous audit working papers. You understand? And that's all, candidates, for today's lesson, in which we have discussed the reasons and the importance of audit documentation, which is also referred to as audit working papers. We've defined audit working papers or audit documentation as detailed record of audit procedures. Because candidates, auditing is a process. Within this process, there are various stages, starting with planning, gathering of evidence, expressing an opinion, testing, internal controls. All those are processes. There are procedures within the process, and the auditor is required to maintain documentation of the work that is carried out. So, audit documentation is also referred to as working papers, and it means or refers to the detailed record of audit procedures that are performed. It may also refer to the relevant audit evidence that is obtained and also the conclusions that the auditor reaches. So in this lesson, we have highlighted the reasons for audit documentation. The first reason is in relation to evidence and compliance with auditing standards. The standards require auditors to maintain working papers. When that happens, then that is evidence that the auditor has complied. The second reason is that audit documentation supports the auditor's report and conclusion. Before reaching an audit opinion, the auditor is required to gather sufficient appropriate evidence. This evidence is part of audit documentation, which supports the auditor's report and opinion. Number 3, accountability and review. Accountability and review. There are times, candidates, when the auditor's work ought also to be audited. For the reviewers to audit the auditor's work, they have to rely on the documentation. And that is one reason why it's important to maintain working papers. The other reason is in relation to planning and performance of audit. Number 4, facilitates communication. Number 5, we have a reason in relation to risk management and mitigation. Then there is knowledge transfer and continuity. And lastly, quality control. Quality control is a reason why the auditor should maintain working papers. Audit documentation, candidates, is subjected to rigorous quality control and review processes, and that ensures that audit procedures are consistently applied and the work is conducted in compliance with the international standards on auditing. So these are 8 reasons. Then we have discussed 6 reasons why audit documentation is important. Those are referring to as importance of audit documentation. 1 is in relation to credibility and reliability. Number 2, transparency. Number 3, working papers can be used as a legal defense for the auditor. They can be used for training. There is also efficiency and reference for future audits. So in closing, candidates, it's important to note that audit documentation is the backbone of quality audit. It ensures that the audit is conducted professionally, provides a reliable basis for the auditor's opinion, and protects both the auditor and the integrity of the financial reporting process. And that's all for today's lesson. Bye-bye.